How you doing, everyone? Welcome back. This is part 8 of a 10-part series where we're going over the Bill of Rights, how the Trump regime has violated or could violate each of these 10 amendments to the Constitution. All right, we found violations of the First Amendment. We found potential ways that the Second and Third can be violated. We have found violations of the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment, and we found potential ways that the Seventh Amendment could be violated. So let's take a look at the Eighth Amendment. All right. I'll tell you point blank, I've already seen how this has been violated. You'll never guess how. If you said something to do with people in El Salvador, yeah, you're probably right. In fact, you're exactly right. But don't think for a moment it's going to stop there. Don't think for a moment it's going to stop there. In fact, it's probably happening here in ways that we don't know about yet. In ways that we don't even know about yet. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Short, sweet, to the point. No excessive bail. Now, you could make the argument that excessive bail has been a thing for a long time, and I tend to agree with that. You know, to put a $20,000 bail on, somebody who might make that in a year seems excessive. Right? Same thing as far as fines. Right? Seems excessive, to have that much of a fine for somebody who doesn't make very much, right? But at the same time, it's kind of vague. It's kind of vague. Excessive could mean different things, right? But if you want to make the argument that we already have excessive bail and excessive fines, I'm inclined to agree with you. Here's where we run into a little bit less of a gray area, but still a gray area. Cruel and unusual punishments. Cannot have cruel and unusual punishment. Now, the Supreme Court ruled at one point that the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment. The Supreme Court later ruled that, you know what? No, it's not. So, basically, a lot of people in the 1970s who were on death row were taken off of death row. In fact, if I remember correctly, that's why Charles Manson was not executed. He was on death row, then he was not on death row because of that Supreme Court decision. And then the Supreme Court reversed their previous decision. So we have the death penalty. And if you want to argue that that's cruel and unusual, I'm inclined to agree with you. There are certain circumstances, though, where I don't really have too much of a problem with the ultimate punishment for certain crimes if we know 100% that person is absolutely guilty. The problem is we have executed the wrong person multiple times throughout history. And to say, well, you know what, it's only been, X percentage of time, it's only been like a 0.5% of a 0.5% or, whatever is all that we've been able to prove. Okay, well, that's way too many. Way too many. I've heard it said that it's better for 1,000 guilty to walk free than for one innocent to be put to death. And I agree with that. absolutely agree with that. Excuse me. So, how exactly is this being violated currently? Well, we have people being ripped out of their homes, away from their families, sent to a foreign country, some of these people have never been to that country before, right? Some of them have never been there. In one particular case, and yes, I'm talking about El Salvador. In one particular case, this guy could not, they didn't say he couldn't be deported. They said he couldn't be deported to El Salvador. And when they get there, they're thrown down to their knees, they have their heads shaved, and, they're thrown into a cage with 60, 70, 80 other guys. I mean, you've probably seen the images of how packed those cells are. It's crazy, right? There's no room to turn around, right? So, I would call that a violation of the Eighth Amendment. Absolutely, that's a violation of the Eighth Amendment. And they don't care. They don't care. I mean, it could also be argued, even though I think it's the 13th Amendment. In fact, yeah, it was the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery except as a condition of imprisonment, like after being found guilty of a crime. I would argue that is probably also cruel and unusual punishment, that particular amendment needs to be amended. I mean, obviously we need to keep the 13th Amendment. It's important. But we need to amend it by, well, taking away the slave labor part for those that are imprisoned. So, we don't know what's happening to those that are being detained in the United States. I've heard some horror stories. In fact, the kids being held in cages. That thing, which, by the way, is not... we don't hear too much about that anymore. I'm sure we will again. I'd call that cruel and unusual punishment. So he violated the Eighth Amendment his first time around. And again, I'd go so far as to argue that his very presidency is cruel and unusual punishment. But I did the right thing on Election Day. Unfortunately, most of those who voted did not. Anyway, know your rights, stand up for your rights, and stand up for everybody else. I'll see you next time.